Hi class, so today we're going to talk about the second part of chapter 5 and we're going to talk about Brazil's different paths to begin. Brazil retained a European dynasty. You remember that Pedro I was in charge and they still had a nobility of dukes, counts, and barons and a tight relationship between the church and state, and they still had slavery in place. The new crop boom was coffee. So I don't know if you remember, before coffee, there was sugar, right? Sugar is the colonial Brazil. And then the coffee will be the new crop for the post-colonial Brazil. So coffee replaced tea in breakfast tables in the United States and many parts of Europe. So I guess this boom really helped to have coffee in the morning in many places in the world. Coffee will be to independent Brazil what sugar was to colonial Brazil. Pedro claimed to be liberal, but he aimed to rule by the grace of God, and he wasn't a very liberal ruling. So by his 1824 constitution, he placed his so-called moderating power above all other branches of government. So he had power over everything. So he's not very liberal. Pedro was becoming very unpopular. His policies, his unpopular wars in the south, and the Portuguese born were still the ones who occupied the highest positions of power in the independent Brazil. The anti-Portuguese riots became more frequent, and they would do Brazil for Brazilians as a slogan. And when Pedro's father died in Portugal, he was the heir to the throne of Portugal. But he renounced the throne in favor of his daughter, but kept his involvement in Portugal through his daughter. Liberals feared recolonization. By 1831, the anti-Portuguese resentment in Rio had reached a high point, and Pedro decided to abdicate, which means to give his crown, the Brazilian crown, to his son Pedro, who was only 5 years old, and return to Portugal. And because he was so unpopular. The regency years are between 1831 and 1840. So regency is somebody else is helping Pedro and ruling on his behalf until he reaches adulthood. So those are the regents, people who are ruling for him until he becomes old enough to rule. And they say that that period of the regency years was very, very rough and stormy in the Brazilian history. The regents were liberal, the regents governing for Pedro, and they wanted to limit the power of the central government. So they reduced the army, gave authority to the local and provincial officials, and Brazilian liberals used nativism to rebel against the central government when all this is going on. So the regents panicked and they put Pedro as king at the age of 14 years old. So Pedro was not ready to be king at that young teenage years. It canceled liberal reforms when he became king, and he built an imperial army and created a centralized national police force. So as he comes into power, they're making more changes that are not making the liberals happy. Communities in daily life. So in general, the people's life changed very little. Remember, the hierarchy remained the same in the Spanish America as in Brazil. And the indigenous people farmed communal lands belonging to their villages. They lived apart and they observed their own customs. The rural people lived as attached workers called peons or peones, working under the landowner's patron. So the landowners in Spanish was patron, and the workers who came with the land were peones. Hacienda peons or peones worked part-time for the patron and part-time growing food for themselves. So it's very interesting because they live in those lands. They have to work for the landowner and part-time, and then the other times they're growing their own foods. Their their main way of supporting themselves was through agriculture rather than the market for food. African people still slaved in plantations in Brazil and Cuba. Landowners had power in post-colonial Latin America. The landowners were the ones who had the most social prestige and political influence. But during this time, you will see how some of the national spirit becomes representative of the Americas. So the folk dances of mestizos, like the Mexican jarabes and Colombian bambucos, represented the national spirit. Even in the Spanish-controlled Cuba, people danced to the African, rhythms, Afro-Cuban rhythms. The Latin American literature in the mid-1800s promoted new national identities with landscape and costumes, and this form of literature was called costumbrismo. Costumbres means customs, and this became very popular as a literary movement at the time. Costumbrista writers will describe dances, dresses, speech, the way people spoke, lives of ordinary folk who lived in the countryside. And this embodied the essence of Latin America. So they're focusing on the countryside. In 1828, the peninsulars are expelled from Mexico due to the nativist spirit. And nativism remained anti-foreign, but it lost its liberal emphasis on social equality. So even though they're rejecting the foreign things, the social equality is not put into practice. There were only a few isolated rebellions, and one is in Yucatan. There was a caste war in Yucatan in which Mayan people wanted to cleanse their land of white and mestizo intruders, and they called themselves Crusoes, people of the cross. The rebellions came only from people like the Mayans and that kept a cultural distance from the largest society. And the whites had once ruled, representing the colonizing power, and the true religion now represented civilization, Paris and London. And they become more Eurocentric, kind of focusing on valuing whatever is coming from Europe, especially from France and England. They will follow their models and look at it as a role model. Spanish and Portuguese had been the languages of the empire, and it was still the main language for laws, administration, and long-distance communication. But it's very ironic because not everybody is literate. So who are the ones who can read? The people at the power, which are the Creoles at the top, or the elite in Brazil, right? So after 1825, you could see that most Latin Americans could neither read or write. So only the persons in power are in charge of the laws, the administration, and also the long-distance communication. University education was only accessible to the elite, and this helped to reach the potential of language, right? So everybody who's at the bottom, who are the indigenous and many of the mestizos, did not have this access to education to achieve the language status. Women were excluded in all of this because the role of women before was just to be home and be housewife. Okay, that's it for now, and then we'll continue with the famous women in the next video. Bye!